This was an extremely difficult and painful first week of the session in the Minnesota Senate. On Tuesday, the first day of the legislative session, the Republican majority engaged in one of the most shameful actions I've ever seen at the Capitol. Why was it so shameful? Because this wasn't an ordinary partisan debate between elected officials. No, this was a partisan attack on the hardworking men and women who work to serve the people of Minnesota at the state Senate. As you know, the Republican members of the Senate Rules Committee voted to cut nearly $500,000 from the staffing budget of the Democratic minority. According to Cal Ludeman, the Republicans' hand-picked Secretary of the Senate, that will cost our caucus 12 to 14 staff members, roughly 1/3 of our entire staff. How many members of their own staff did the Republican majority choose to cut? 0. So how did the Republican majority defend such a blatantly unfair and partisan attack? In committee, Senator Senjum said it was because the DFL minority staffing budget, even after these cuts were enacted, would be, quote, $160,000 more than the Republican majority's budget, even though you're 7 members less at this point, he said. The budget document that was presented in committee by Secretary Ludeman presented the same information. Sounds reasonable, right? According to the Republicans, we have bigger salary budget for fewer members, and their proposed cuts would simply level the playing field and make things more equitable. The only problem is Senator Senjum's statement is completely untrue. Yesterday morning, our caucus asked the Secretary of the Senate's office to supply us with a current roster of the Senate staff. They gave us a hard copy of the Senate staff roster, which we spent hours inputting into spreadsheets so that we could get the truth about the Senate budget. What we found disproves the claims made by the Republican members of the Rules Committee, as well as the handout presented by Secretary Ludeman. Is the Senate DFL minority budget larger than the Republican majority? No. In terms of total staff salary, the Senate Republican budget is over 60% larger than the staffing budget in our caucus, even when we ignore the fact that the Republican majority is currently in the process of hiring several more staff. Furthermore, even if you remove the committee administrators from the equation, the Republican majority's staffing budget is still 24% larger than ours in the minority. In other words, comparing non-committee related caucus staff, the Senate Republicans are currently spending $481,000 more than we are in the minority. In reality, if we were to make the Republicans' proposed $444,000 cut to our staff, the Republican caucus would then have a $925,000 more to spend on non-committee staff than would our caucus. That means that the claim made by the Republican leaders that our caucus would have $160,000 more to serve fewer members was wrong by over $1 million. So now we're left wondering, why were we presented with such misleading data at the Senate Rules hearing? There seems to be 3 possibilities. 1, somebody made a mistake. 2, somebody lied. 3, somebody intentionally manipulated the data to mislead members of the Senate committee and the public. Believe me, I intend to get answers to these questions. Whatever the explanation, we now know that the only justification the Republican majority could give for their blatantly partisan decision was completely false. We also know that the vote in the Tuesday's Rules Committee was taken under the influence of misleading and inaccurate information provided by a Senate employee who is supposed to be the administrator of the entire Senate. I believe it's important that we revisit the issue as soon as possible. Later today, I will be sending a letter to Senator Senjum, the Senate Majority Leader and Chair of the Rules Committee. I will explain that the information we were provided regarding the Senate budget was misleading and inaccurate, and I will ask him to call another Rules Committee hearing as soon as possible. During that hearing, I hope that we will accomplish 3 important tasks: review accurate, detailed, and up-to-date numbers regarding the Senate budget, receive a full explanation as to why members of the Rules Committee were providing misleading and inaccurate information from the Secretary of the Senate, and reconsider our vote on the Senate budget and delay further action until we've had the opportunity to draft a new budget plan that fairly distributes staffing reductions between the two caucuses. Let me end with 2 important points. All the raw data we reviewed before making this announcement was provided to us by the Secretary of the Senate. It is public data. If you'd like to see the information we were provided or the spreadsheets we prepared using the data, just contact my staff. We are not here to complain about having to make staffing cuts in the Senate. These are difficult times, and the legislature is cutting throughout state government. We should not be immune, and we have always supported sharing the pain whenever difficult cuts are made. Over the last several years, the DFL voted to cut millions out of the Senate budget. And when we did so, we made sure that those cuts were distributed equitably. But this is a story about fairness. It's a story about honesty. And it's a story about an abuse of power that will impact the careers and lives of many people. The Republican majority's actions set a terrible precedent for our institution and a terrible tone for the rest of this session. And the fact that these decisions were made while relying on inaccurate, misleading, or fabricated data only further erodes trust within our body. We know there will have to be cuts. We're just asking the majority party to not go down this dangerous partisan path. The men and women who work at the Minnesota Senate are talented, dedicated, hardworking, and they don't deserve to have their careers and livelihoods endangered in an ugly partisan game. Times are tough, and cuts will have to be made. But let's do it fairly, and more importantly, let's do it honestly. That concludes my prepared remarks.